Welcome, Katharina. We're happy that you were able to come, and we are sorry that you were stuck in the airport. We all know this is a painful experience, and at least we're almost done here. So you're going to have to work for another 2 hours, and then your well-deserved rest. And speaking of which, we would be very thankful if you could give your presentation now.
Thank you very much. I actually met on Sunday night in Washington Airport. I met Danny Kaufman. Some of you might know him. He's sort of Mr. Governance, or he used to be Mr. Governance at the World Bank. He now works for Revenue Watch in New York, and he was trying to go to London. I was trying to go to Sao Paulo. He said the combination of Washington, D.C., United Airlines, and bad weather is a real killer, and that's what we got. Anyway, having said that, I will take you into slightly different terrain than what you probably have been doing all day in my absence, unfortunately. And the terrain is actually, it is sort of the Euro, but I wanted to frame it a little bit more broadly so you understand what this project is all about. So I've been developing over the last couple of years a new framework for me to understand the relationship between law and finance, and I've been trying to rope other people into it. I'm running now a little doctoral program in collaboration with Oxford and Frankfurt, and maybe at some point we can expand it to Sao Paulo or other places when you have one as well here. The idea of this framework is basically sort of captured in the title, which I call the legal theory of finance, the title of a paper that I published earlier this year. And the legal theory of finance basically has 4 premises, and I will put them on the table before I go into the discussion of the Euro, or 4 features, and is built on 2 premises. The 4 features really are, first, that financial systems are legally constructed. Our contemporary financial systems cannot be understood other than by understanding their legal construction. And depending on how we construct them, of course, they can be quite different. Under conditions of fundamental uncertainty and liquidity volatility, which I take as premises and don't further explain, but I build these premises on a large literature and I think widely observable facts. Under the premises of fundamental uncertainty and liquidity volatility, a legally constructed system can set itself up on autopilot to self-destruction. And the simple reason is that if you enforce all rules as written ex ante, irrespective of any changes in the future, you will destroy the system. Because if you enforce all contracts in a downward spiral, you accelerate the downward spiral, but you don't do anything to rescue it. Okay? So this is what I call the law of finance paradox. So we have 2 features already, the legal construction of financial markets, and then the law and finance paradox that necessarily follows. The question is, what do we do in times of crisis or in times when the law and finance paradox is threatening to bring down the financial system? Typically, we suspend the full force of the law. We make law more elastic. There are, in fact, many ways in which existing legal rules have elasticity built into them, but they become particularly important in moments of crisis. The best example, perhaps, is when in the Federal Reserve Act, when it says the Federal Reserve can lend against adequate collateral. What becomes adequate collateral in a crisis moment is quite different than at different points in time. So here, elasticity is suggested, although its specific manifestation will take place only in the context of the crisis. So once we have understood that a legally constructed financial system is in danger of endogenous self-destruction, but can be rescued by making the law even more elastic than it might otherwise be, we are, of course, also entering a realm where we have to think about power, because when you have the power to determine where to make law elastic or in whose favor to suspend the law, then I think we have to start thinking about a new political economy of finance, and that's something that still has to be done, I think. Just to reiterate again, legal construction of finance, law of finance paradox, elasticity of law, and power. And then the 4th one is what I call essential hybridity of financial systems. Financial systems are never just private or state. They are always necessarily both. Every financial system where you trade financial assets, first of all, relies extensively on the enforceability of these assets. So private financial innovation is done, especially when it's made for the purpose of arbitration, of arbitraging around existing rules. It is made in light of existing rules so that it will not be declared void by any regulator or court in the future. So it is basically built into an existing regulatory structure. But perhaps even more importantly, when you think about what happens in financial crisis, we actually see the realization of what my colleague at Barnard in Columbia has called the inherent hierarchy of finance realize itself, namely that when people are trying to find buyers for their assets and can no longer do that, they have to find liquidity from somebody else, and typically they just have to go a step higher in the hierarchy to somebody who has bigger pockets. And when you go step by step through the hierarchy of finance, where you end up is at the central bank. And when you have a central bank that does not issue its own currency or borrows predominantly in foreign currency, then it has to go even further. Then it cannot rescue its own financial system, but it has to go to the IMF, or in the European context, it has to go to the ECB or the Troika with the IMF and the European Commission as well. So financial systems are inherently hierarchical is something that I borrow and I think fits perfectly nicely with my theory. Now, I've developed this theory, and I really think that the euro is probably the best application for really teasing out the strengths and maybe also weaknesses of this theory, because clearly the euro is legally constructed, right? We don't have to go back into the big theories about what is money. Is money state-made, or is it actually spontaneously made by private actors? The euro clearly was made top-down, and the structures for the system in which the euro operates had to be created. And by looking at the process of creation and then also looking at the euro area through the lens of the continuing crisis in Europe, I'm hoping basically to shed new light on the explanatory power of this theory, but perhaps also modify it a little bit along the way. I've circulated along with the two chapters, just an outline so you get sort of an idea where these two chapters are situated, but I don't want to take too much time. I think 15 minutes is what I have, something like that. I don't want to go over the different chapters, that makes a little sense, but I want to talk about the two chapters that I did circulate. One is about money's hierarchy, and I want to ask the question here, how does hierarchy manifest itself in a currency union, right? Does the currency union still have hierarchy, or have you abolished hierarchy when you have established a currency union? And the second one is about the elasticity of law and the locus of power. And that question I find particularly relevant because of the way in which the Eurozone has been constructed, and because how the crisis has pushed, as I argue in the chapter, the European Central Bank to assume the very apex of the Eurosystem. Before that, it wasn't really clear where power would reside. But when the ECB came out in July of 2012 and said, we announced the outright monetary transaction program, we will also do whatever it takes to protect our currency, just as Bernanke had said in the fall of 2008. Then it was pretty clear that it's the ECB that steps in, and of course that raises then the further question, can the ECB do what the Fed does? Does it have the same kind of backup? And that's something for another chapter, but I will nonetheless say a few words about that. So let me start with the money's hierarchy in a currency union. What I do in this chapter is basically to say, okay, we understand that financial systems are inherently hierarchical. If you have liquidity volatility, whenever there's a liquidity crunch, you always have to find an asset that bears greater liquidity. And you basically have to find typically somebody who will buy your assets and share with you this liquidity, or you go under. So private entities are constrained. They have a binding survival constraint. They have, as Janos Konak called it in the context of the former socialist economy, a hard budget constraint, but public entities have a soft budget constraint. So those who are at the very top of this hierarchy, those who control unlimited access to high-powered money, of course, have a soft budget constraints, or you can flip it the other way around. Whoever has the power to issue as much money as they wish without being constrained in any way is by that very definition a public entity, whatever else you may want to call it. So even the Bank of England, before it was nationalized, in that sense was public rather than private, irrespective of its ownership structure. So once you say money is hierarchical, we always push it up to the apex of the system in the context of a financial crisis, then you, of course, have to think about, so is this true only within domestic financial system, or is it also true for global financial system? And I assert here, in part building on Perry Merling's work, yes, that it's also true in global financial systems. And it's very well expressed if you just open any newspaper, the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, in how currencies are compared with one another. First, the US dollar is compared with all the other major currencies, right? The euro against the dollar, the Canadian dollar against the dollar, the Swiss franc against the dollar. And then the major currencies are compared to one another. And then some of them are compared to lesser currencies, and some currencies never ever show up. So you can see the hierarchy of money. And of course, it does express itself, again, mostly in crisis, when everything else is up in the air. Everybody wants to have dollar assets in our global economy. The dollar and the Fed are at the very top of our global financial system. So what role then do different foreign exchange regimes play in the hierarchy? And what I'm saying basically in this chapter is that they don't change hierarchy, because hierarchy is really is a reflection of the ability of different issues of money to redeem them and offer alternative assets for liquidity purposes. And that has a lot to do with how your political, economic, and social system operates, and is something that is deeply structural that you can't simply do away with by any kind of foreign currency regime. So I'm basically walking through the different regimes that we have. We have on the one extreme a fixed exchange rate regime, on the other one we have a floating one. The gold standard, of course, is a particular manifestation of the fixed regime. And what you do there is you commit ex ante that you're trying to sustain a particular rate, and you impose certain policies internally in order to be able to sustain a rate over time. But as we know from experience, no fixed rates ever are sustained forever. They always pop up, and they pop when frictions can no longer be suppressed, and when alignment is not possible through coordination and political negotiations. This is when you get off the gold standard. This is when you went off the earlier versions in the Eurozone to try to coordinate foreign exchange rate policies. On the other extreme, in floating rate regimes, we see basically the hierarchy manifest itself much more on a daily basis, and it doesn't really seem to be so hierarchical, but we see the flotation, and of course the price for that is volatility, which is also a huge price to pay, but certainly the system is somewhat more adaptable. The one thing that system does not do, it really doesn't bring to the fore or remind us of the need of some final backstop, even of a floating currency regime. So for the gold standard, we know in the end we want to convert everything to gold, right? With a fixed standard, we probably think about the currency against we're pegging as the final currency that matters. With a floating one, we don't really know, and yet markets, I think, are hugely aware of the fact who might be able to stand in for their currency better than others, and that would then be the one that manifests itself at the hierarchy of the system. So coming to the Eurozone, of course, we have a currency union, and the currency union, as I argue, does not change structural differences. It was actually hoped that it would. So I think the monetarists in the German Bundesbank, in the central bank, and those who were pushing for greater integration of the currency after they had experienced that they could not maintain coordinated exchange rate regimes throughout the 70s and 1980s. The idea was that finally, by imposing a foreign currency, we would really have the straitjacket that would force policymakers in the different countries to make good on their promises and change policies so finally that everybody would look a little bit more like Germany in the end. And obviously this didn't quite happen, for better or for worse. But what is so interesting when you read the debates going back into the 60s, 70s, really to the 60s, 70s, the standpoints of the different actors have not changed. Germany has said the same thing since the 70s. We're great. We can manage our affairs, and other people shall just follow us. And France and Italy have always said, you are exporting too much, you're relying on a model that puts too much cost on us, and we have had the same debates. We've just tried different ways in which we could manage them. And of course, the paradox of the currency union is that by putting everybody into the straitjacket, the system was brought to the very brink of collapse. So that's basically the broad argument. The currency union cannot change the frictions. But here's another layer, and that goes again to the legal construction of financial markets. In order to create a monetary union, the ECB and its counterparts, the still national central banks that are part of the European system of central banks in the different member states that had adopted the common currency, they had to do a lot of both legal and institutional work to make the monetary union operate. And that, of course, then also framed and shaped the kind of market that did emerge. Right? So what do you have to do to create a monetary union? Well, the first thing you have to do, you have to create some system that makes sure that banks in Greece are treated like banks in Germany, that actually you no longer have a geographic discount. but that you will shift money and claims from one bank to another across boundaries, irrespective of national origin, just because it has made its way into a reserve account of the national central banks, and then you shift it across. So they created a common Euro-wide payment system, building on existing payment systems, and of course there are also international payment systems. But this one, the Target 1 and then later Target 2, is for the Eurozone, but can be extended. Countries are members of that system that are not members of the Eurozone as well. But you had to create a payment system that will make sure that we do not discriminate amongst banks. All banks that are eligible to participate in the system should have access to a system that looks only at whether or not certain assets are in place so that they can shift it to the other side. And the accounting actually is done, of course, in the European system of central banks, not so much between national central banks when they intermediate between banks from different countries, but on the balance sheet of the European Central Bank. So the payment system was crucial, but it also is, of course, it rests on the idea that actually banks in these different countries are alike. And the other, even more important policy issue was what actually will be the interest rate, or how shall the ECB convey to the markets, now the entire monetary union, what interest rates it would like to have, through what type of instruments. Now in the US, it's done through buying and selling treasuries, right? Of course, it's a deep and liquid market in treasury securities. That does not exist in the European Union, in the Eurozone, because we do not have a common debt instrument, and the ECB was explicitly prevented from privileging sovereign debt over private debt. So what did the ECB do? It basically increasingly targeted the overnight financing rate and was basically looking at markets in which repo markets and collateralized short-term debt markets. It gave up to 8,000 banks throughout the Eurozone access to its liquidity provisioning. Usually it's typically around 1,400 that really participate, but it did accept a much wider range of collateral, of privately created collateral against liquidity from the get-go, because that was its way of creating a unified European market through which they could convey the kind of monetary policies that would make a monetary union that, of course, did not exist at the get-go. So you can really see how the institutional arrangements that they created at the time helped make a market, but one of my concerns here is, of course, they also fueled a particular kind of market. Once actors figured out that you could always get liquidity from the ECB if you just offered the right collateral, then, of course, producing collateral became a very attractive issue. And I think if we put the rise of the global collateralized instrument markets into the perspective and put the European Central Bank into this picture, we could even argue that they were one of the major motors, not the only one, but an important motor for fueling these kind of production of collateral. The ECB recognizes that in some policy papers. It's a little hidden. They say the Fed claims that they don't affect market prices or markets in a direct way. We recognize that we do, and probably through the collateral assets, and they said this already prior to the crisis. I think I don't want to say much more about this chapter, but I hope you get a little bit of the flavors of currency unions. Sort of cannot do away with the fundamental political, economic, financial structures. But by putting a monetary union in place, you also have to create certain legal institutions that allow you to at least pretend that you have something like a single monetary system. And this appearance of the institutional structures that you create is still nonetheless in frictions with the underlying social and financial structures. And I think that all burst into the open when the crisis came. Let me just say a few more words about the second chapter that I circulate. And here I really want to give you the quote, which I love so much, by my former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who's actually going to turn 95 in January. He attended in 1978 as the first chancellor in Germany. He went to a meeting of the Council of the Bundesbank, the German central bank, to convince the bankers to agree or not to oppose that he would sign the European Monetary System Treaty, which would give France yet another chance to participate in a coordinated exchange rate regime after it had popped out for the second time in just under 2 years. So Schmidt goes to Frankfurt and talks to the Bundesbank folks, and one of the wonderful quotes that I first found in Harold James' book, and then I got the whole German transcript of the meeting, which is a fascinating read. But the quote here is, "There has been a beautiful saying in the world for 2,000 years, ultra posse nemo obligata, and where the ultra posse lies, one decides for oneself. So if, the legal obligation one has extend only as far as one has power to fulfill them. And one, of course, decides for oneself when one no longer can do that. So this is the ultra posse lies, where the ultra posse lies, one decides for oneself. And I pair this with this quote by Mario Draghi, the president of the ECB in July 2012, who said, "Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough." So Schmidt in 1978 tells the Bundesbankers, we have to enter into this treaty. And the Bundesbank says, what we don't like about the treaty is that Germany commits in the treaty to stand in and buy as many francs or lira as they have to destabilize those currencies so that they don't pop out of the currency regime again. We want a ceiling. We will not do an unlimited commitment. And Schmidt says, of course, in substance, I agree with you, but we can't write this into a treaty. We will decide when our limit has been reached, but we won't write this into the treaty. And what makes this whole conversation so interesting is that he puts this conversation into a very global perspective, a geopolitical perspective, and says Germany has grown too strong. Says it's 1978. Germany has grown too strong, and we have two problems. We have the legacy of Auschwitz, and we have Berlin. Remember, 78 is still long before the wall fell. And so we have to compromise somewhere else. We cannot be perceived in Europe as to be the strong man. So what we do is we create the monetary system. We make these kind of commitments, but where the ultra posse lies, we will decide for ourselves. That they do in 1978. The point of this entire chapter is to show that once a currency union has been created, pushed by Germany to a very extreme form of currency union with a very strong, independent central bank, Germany has lost the power to determine where the ultra posse lies. That now lies with the ECB, which is why actually the president of the German central bank now is making his arguments in front of the German Constitutional Court, because he has lost the vote in the ECB in 2012, when the majority, the Bundesbank was the only one dissenting, said we will do the outright monetary transaction, the purpose of which was a commitment by the ECB to buy as many sovereign debts on the secondary market as necessary to avoid the collapse of the euro. The ECB is prohibited under treaty law to buy sovereign debt on the primary market because of the fear from the get-go, especially by Germany, that it would simply monetize fiscal debt, but it can buy sovereign debt on the secondary market. The Bundesbank, of course, now says you're doing what amounts to monetary financing, even if you say it's on the secondary market. And Draghi says, I'm staying strictly within the limits of the law. And then I think the subtext to that is, and actually Weidmann, the president of the Bundesbank, is quite explicit about it. He says in a filing with the Constitutional Court in Germany, it is not up for the ECB to take the measures necessary to even decide whether the Eurozone will survive. That's for others to decide. This is basically in the hands of the member states or the European Commission or other institutions within Euro, not for the ECB. And Draghi, of course, says our job is to retain price stability, and the very good precondition for price stability in the Eurozone is to save the euro. So we will do whatever it takes to save the euro. And that argument, of course, will not play itself out directly in the German Constitutional Court, because it's only through a back door that they even talk about the ECB. Clearly, the German Constitutional Court has no jurisdiction over the ECB. But the German Constitutional Court has jurisdiction over the adoption of a treaty that creates the European Stability Mechanism, which is a treaty entered into by member states of the Eurozone, that they would put money aside, basically, to capitalize or help capitalize countries, sovereigns, not banks. There's a debate ongoing, but the treaty still is written to say that countries that basically have bailed out their own financial system and are about to go under, they can have access to the European Stability Mechanism to get liquidity if they face a sovereign debt crisis. The adoption of this treaty was challenged in Germany at the Constitutional Court. A preliminary injunction in the fall of 2012 failed, and the final decision is still not out yet. It will probably come out early next year. The argument is that Germany is at least implicitly making an unlimited financial commitment to the Eurozone, and that this undermines the principle of democracy, because democracy is inextricably linked with the notion of budgetary sovereignty, and if Germany writes a blank check to Greece and Portugal and other southern states on the periphery, that's basically undermining Germany's sovereignty. Now, I'm not sure how the Constitutional Court will come out. So far, it always has barked and not bitten. So I don't think it will necessarily do that. But I did talk to some other governors of central bank, the one from Austria recently, who fears that perhaps the Constitutional Court might constrain the German central bank, which is of course part of the European system, from taking certain actions, and that this might have adverse effect on the Eurozone. We'll see. The point of the chapter is to talk about the law finance paradox in the context of the euro, right? So the Eurozone was constructed by treaty and by statute in a way that created a really independent central bank, but one that was exclusively committed to the notion of price stability, was prevented from monetary financing, and was supposed to play by the rule, and everybody else was supposed to play by the rules too, like not encounter too much debt, etc., which everybody fudged, of course, including Germany and France. But by playing by these rules, the system was supposed to be sustainable. Now, I'm arguing, of course, based on my broader theoretical concept, that that is a fallacy anyway, because in a world of uncertainty and liquidity volatility, you've got to have some flexibility in any governance structure that you create. And certainly the euro crisis has basically pushed the system to the brink of collapse. And what we've seen in that situation is the ECB come out and say, okay, we'll stand in. We'll do whatever it takes. The problem is, that's my final point, and then I'll stop. The problem is that the ECB has no polity to back it. No single polity to back it, right? It is powerful financially, so economists sit down and do calculations where they would have the financial firepower to step in, and the answer to that question probably is yes. The key problem is a political one. Will, let's say, Germany pull out? And as long as you have the uncertainty about whether everybody who is supposed to stand in for the commitment the ECB makes, essentially, on behalf of the Eurozone, as long as there are political questions about that, I think the currency will remain under attack. It doesn't have to collapse, but it will just muddle through. So the final point then is financial systems or money systems might be hierarchical, but the ultimate entity on the apex must always be a polity. Without a polity, no financial system can sustain itself in the long term. It doesn't say how the polity has to look like, but we need one. Thank you.
Katharina Pistor is writing a big themed book. The focus is on the euro, which is probably no less than the most ambitious monetary experiment in the history of mankind. The euro is next in importance only to the dollar. It circulates as legal tender in several European countries and serves as reserve currency or peg in many parts of the world. And more importantly, it increasingly compels European nations to blend their sovereignty into a unique European state. Ostensibly, the euro was born under the spell of legalism, or more presciently, of legal governance, to draw on a term often used by Katharina in some of her older writings. It is premised on the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, as later amended by other treaties, especially the Treaty of Lisbon, which provides the constitutional basis for the European Union. In disciplining legislative, executive, and judiciary functions within the European Union, this constitutional basis creates a legal and institutional framework designed to consolidate the European Union and ensure the sustainability of the euro over time. Chiefly among its provisions is the establishment of the European Central Bank, which is headquartered in Frankfurt and administers the monetary policy of the Eurozone. The outburst of the US financial crisis after 2008 has brought turmoil to the Eurozone. Together with problems of low growth and in some countries lack of competitiveness, the ensuing government debt and banking crisis now threaten the very integrity of the euro system. The resulting set of events is now testing the resilience of the European Union's institutional framework. Katharina's book seems to focus specifically in framing how, if at all, these changes are constrained by the original political pacts that led to the creation of the euro. Katharina's take on these recent and sometimes dramatic events is neither strictly economic nor legalistic, but I should claim they are institutionalist instead. On one hand, she seems to believe, and in my view, correctly so, that to understand the euro, it is more important to comprehend the structure of the existing monetary institutions and the political pacts that underlie them, rather than the abstract economic models that predict optimal solutions. On the other hand, she devotes a lot of attention to the euro's legal construction, and in so doing, she acknowledges the importance of legal analysis, while at the same time making it clear that, quote, law is meant to limit the abuse of power, but it cannot eliminate it, end quote. Katharina's analysis can, in my opinion, be labeled institutionalist, also because in her account of the evolution of the monetary arrangements in Europe, power emerges as a paramount consideration. Power is in fact a crucial component in both book chapters that I will briefly address in my comment. And the centrality of power is perhaps the unifying topic of her book, or so it seems to me. Chapter 5 is titled Money Hierarchy in a Currency Union. It explains how and why the European Central Bank acted while actually reinventing certain rules as it tried to manage Europe's financial crisis. In particular, Katharina explains that in establishing the European Central Bank, quote, any direct financial support for governments was explicitly ruled out, end quote. The European Central Bank was prevented from acquiring public debt of member states and was also required not to privilege public over private debt. Member states were then purposely left, again I quote, at the mercy of international lending markets, end quote. At the moment of its inception, the assumed logic of this euro system was that having the same currency would automatically discipline, profligate governments and force every member state in Europe to improve and harmonize policy. Open quote. Monetary union was thus meant as a straitjacket fortified by limits on sovereign borrowing and the prohibition to monetize public debt by the ECB, end quote. By forcing European countries to improve policy, the adoption of the euro would expectably prompt a reduction of deep-seated structural differences amongst euro members. In so doing, not only would the euro solve the problem of coordinating currencies in the midst of financial integration, but it would also flatten the hierarchy, that is, the differences in power amongst different states. So in moving on with the long-standing post-World War II European project, the euro would also serve to equalize power within Europe. This was the theory, but in practice, things played out differently. For reasons that are not addressed in the book chapters that I received, but that are in fact well known, structural differences amongst member states were never harmonized. These chapters also do not explain the drivers of the irresponsible levels of leverage reached by European banks. In any case, the point made by Katharina is that when, open quote, the music stopped playing, end quote, that is, the Minsky moment that came up when credit markets dried up in September 2008 after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, hierarchy inside Europe returned with a vengeance. Stronger economies, notably Germany, experienced no decrease in their refinancing rates, whereas for weaker ones, refinancing rates rapidly moved beyond sustainable rates. So Katharina's claim here is that hierarchy manifested itself not in the usual foreign exchange movements, whereby the value of the currency of insolvent countries suddenly plummets, but in different access conditions to lending markets within the euro system in the form of different refinancing rates. The lesson she derives is clear. In finance, you can temporarily hide, but you cannot get rid of hierarchy. Hierarchy evokes notions of obedience and command, But there is an irony in this account of the evolution of the euro system. The irony is that the hierarchy inside the euro system, again in the form of widening yield gaps within different member states, only became visible as investors noticed that the European Constitution would most likely be strictly obeyed. Investors suddenly noticed that the ECB would perhaps not bail out member states, and to be sure, direct government financing by the ECB had been forbidden all along. In other words, lending markets had assumed that member states would always be bailed out by the ECB, even if European law unambiguously established otherwise. So one is driven to inquire about whether the European Monetary Constitution was devised to crystallize in law, or instead to hide through law the actual political pacts that led to the creation of the euro. And the suspicion that European law may have been, in part at least, a disguise for the actual political pacts underlying the creation of the Eurozone, in fact increases as one reads the other chapter here in comment, namely chapter 6, titled Law's Elasticity and the Locus of Power. This chapter starts with a fascinating account of the views of Helmut Schmidt, the skillful diplomat who served from 1974 to 1982 as Chancellor of what was then West Germany, and later became a leading advocate for the creation of the European Monetary Union and the European Central Bank. If I understand correctly Katharina's point, Chancellor Schmidt viewed the creation of the European monetary system in 1972, which was a predecessor of the euro, as a viable alternative for Germany to exercise its economic power in a kind of disguised fashion, for back then Germany, open quote, could not afford to be perceived as dominating European affairs, end quote. And one is, by the way, inclined to consider whether such resistance to Germany's prominence still exists now that another 3 decades have passed. And Katharina expressly espouses the same doubt. In any case, Katharina explains that in 1979, the Bundesbank legal mandate under Germany law, which just like today was to maintain currency stability, would shield it from any obligation to finance other European countries. So, says Katharina, German adhesion to European monetary arrangement would always be made under the proviso of ultra posse nemo obligator, which is the Latin adagio under which one's obligations cannot extend beyond one's abilities. At the same time, the extent to which German domestic law would indeed prevent the Bundesbank from actively promoting orderly adjustment of exchange rates or even bailing out other countries were from the onset known to be elastic. To put it in rough terms, it is as if in deepening its integration with Europe, Germany would always be in a position to tell other countries, sorry, I very much wished I could help you, but the laws of my country prevent me from doing that. And yet, a sufficient amount of political will and momentum could mean that the law could be twisted and interpreted otherwise. For, as put by Katharina, open quote, defining where one's legal obligations end is, of course, a privilege only those in power can exercise, end quote. And the assumption is that economic fundamentals would always place Germany in a position of power. This story is not brought by Katharina to make the case that monetary laws are irrelevant, but rather to make the case that they are elastic. The elasticity of monetary laws mean that all parties know ex ante that the agreed upon legal commitments will possibly be relaxed or suspended in the future. This elasticity, perhaps we could call it power-dependent application of monetary law, is relevant because, for better or worse, the fact remains that bailout programs in Europe were in fact put in place, and Germany played a notoriously crucial part in them. Given that sovereign bailouts were in principle prohibited under supranational, and in the case of Germany, national law, a question remains about what made this possible. Clearly, the European Central Bank effectively conducted outright public financing, and this remains true regardless of the fact that it only bought sovereign bonds in secondary markets and subject to conditionalities. So a legal commitment was suspended, or at the very least relaxed, and this is for Katharina the very definition of loss elasticity. Loss elasticity is closely linked with what Katharina cleverly calls the law finance paradox. This is the notion that when, open quote, the full force of law is relaxed or suspended to take account of changes in circumstances, end quote, precisely to avoid bringing down the financial system, the credibility law lends to finance in the first place is undermined. What this means, in short, is that the preservation of financial markets depends, temporarily at least, upon the occasional subversion of their constitutive rules. In particular, because liquidity is volatile and may disappear in times of panic, a surprising conclusion ensues. A financial crash can happen precisely because everybody plays by the rules of the game, not because they breach them. The implication is that in financial markets, law's integrity is of no importance when liquidity dries up, for the crucial question simply becomes, open quote, who gets to decide, close quote. Viewed in this light, the world of finance can be simply recast as the world of what legal theorists have called decisionism, because the assumed role of law is more that of legitimating power rather than that of effectively creating legalistic rule-based realm for decision-making. The dangerous implication is that in the realm of finance, rule of law can The dangerous implication is that in the realm of finance, the rule of law can again be recast as a form of romanticism, a childish fiction, to borrow from the classics of illiberal theory. Too bad for Democrats and others interested in procedural-based legitimation. Leaving normative questions on the side, the fact remains that Katharina's account of the actual workings of monetary law within the Eurozone seems persuasive enough. And to be sure, I see no reason why this framework could not be expanded to other parts of the world. In particular, I believe that much can be gained by applying Katharina's framework to other places, including Brazil. To illustrate, a recent IMF paper titled From Lombard Street to Avenida Paulista, Foreign Exchange Liquidity Easing in Brazil in Response to the Global Shock of 2008-2009, explains in detail several unorthodox measures adopted by the Brazilian Central Bank, all of which would have been unthinkable other than in times of rapidly decreasing liquidity in financial markets. And more generally, there is now a relatively large body of literature explaining the kinds of unconventional measures adopted by central banks worldwide during the latest financial crisis. And I believe that there is a lot of elasticity in these measures. Having said that all is fair and square in Katharina's writings, and let me add here, I believe her scholarship is one of the most insightful and creative produced in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. I should point to what might be an overstatement in her line of argumentation. Katharina writes that, open quote, the central bank is where monetary and credit systems meet, and where in times of crisis they merge, end quote. While this claim is vindicated by the recent history of the Eurozone, in other countries, things might play out differently. Consider again the Brazilian case. In the wake of the 2008-2009 crisis, the Brazilian government devised a comprehensive strategy to fight the crisis that involved several governmental bodies. This strategy relied not only on the Brazilian central bank, but very importantly also on state-owned banks, particularly Banco do Brasil. Banco do Brasil is a state-owned commercial bank listed in the Brazilian Stock Exchange that was largely used by the Brazilian government as a tool to address solvency and liquidity problems that arose during the crisis. Specifically, Banco do Brasil provided cash to banks facing liquidity constraints, premised on a political accord that involved various branches of the federal government. Banco do Brasil acquired credit portfolios of over 30 banks, amounting to overall 14 billion reais, which was approximately $8 billion back then. It's actually $6.5 billion today. In any case, in a nutshell, Banco do Brasil effectively used its lending capability in order to help manage the crisis. Evidently, Katharina's analysis is centered in the Eurozone, so a discussion of the credit management role of state-owned banks is of much lesser relevance. Yet the point I wish to make is that if we wish to expand her conceptual framework beyond Europe, and I see many reasons why we should do that, then we might need to look beyond central banks. I conclude by noting that there can be little doubt that during severe financial crisis, orthodoxies give space to considerations of expediency. Given the frequency and severity of financial crisis, financial regulation gets to be in permanent mutation. And there can be only a limited space for nostalgia, because there is no going back. Scholars of financial regulation are therefore condemned not only to try to second-guess the whims of power, but are also constantly trying to catch up with the ever-changing institutional landscape. It's not an easy task, but the conceptual framework laid out by Katharina Pistor is of great helpfulness.
But as you know, I've always been intrigued by the legal theory of finance, and I think you hit it on the head at the beginning of your comments here, where you said that this both really brings to life the theory in an incredibly powerful way, but also, I think, sheds light on complexities inherent in trying to figure out how that actually operates in practice that might be interesting to delve into further. And there are a lot. So one of the ones, I think, that Bruno, for example, was hitting on is that one of your points all along is that there's been this inherent law finance paradox where if we enforce all legal obligations fully, then of course it's on a road to self-destruction when the conditions of uncertainty and illiquidity become manifest in particular settings. And I think what you, particularly in the second chapter here, are drawing attention to is there's actually not only is that going to be resolved by the hierarchy that you've traditionally pointed to, which is a hierarchy of power based in part, or arising at least in part from these structural differences that were never fully reconciled, but there's a different hierarchy, and that is a hierarchy embedded in the law because, of course, we have overlapping legal regimes and we have different legal commitments. And so I feel like you're kind of hinting at that in the second chapter, but kind of playing out that how that hierarchy also interacts with a hierarchy that you've previously spent a lot of time, I think, delving into would be really interesting for me. I also think going back to the kind of the first chapter, or the first of the two that you present, because you do, I think, so nicely use the ECB to illustrate the constitutive role of law, I wanted to at times get more of the granular details. You talk, for example, about open market operations on one hand, lending facilities on the other, but you don't talk much about the interaction between the two, even though you then make reference to the Fed being very different with their relationship with primary dealers, or of course the Fed also has the discount window, which is open to a much broader array of banks. So I was trying to figure out, is this really different, or is it more difference in how banks use it, because there's a difference in expectations in how they use it, rather than necessarily in eligibility. And similarly, I think there's a bunch of kind of ways to look at, not that you have to bring in the Fed, but understanding how this is similar and different than the Fed might help shed light on some of the dynamics you look at, because there is a really interesting history there as well, where they similarly were, for very similar reasons, prohibited on the primary market from buying treasuries, though of course now, I mean, their role if you look at their balance sheet, and owning treasuries has incredible implications in terms of the primary market and how that happened. I think drawing attention to kind of the fact that ECB didn't have that even as an option is really interesting once open market operations become the primary tool of monetary policy. Yeah, I feel like I have more to say, but let me kind of stop there, even though I have a lot more I could do.
Just to tell you that this semester, my course on state and market in Brazilian financing, we use your paper on elasticity to describe the Brazilian system, where we have a lot of discretion. So we use elasticity as a way of deal with the discretion of the state-owned banks in the Brazilian finance. So students are there and they are very happy to be here. And just a very quick provocation to Bruno. It's very interesting to see a Hayekian guy or a very rule of law oriented guy admiring the elasticity of law.
Very little to add from what Bruno was saying, but one of the things that I really liked about the project in general is, from my point of view, it undermines the sort of like financial exceptionalism, sort of the technocratic illusion that in some ways through hand waving and competency that you can sort of transcend politics, in the sense that the social theorist Giorgio Agamben said, the sovereign is he who exists in the state of exception. Right? And you can't escape that in any particular context. Now, in that traditional theorization, you're talking about a monarch permanently in the state of exception, but what we're really talking about here is in modern times who can and does step into that state of exception to resolve these issues. And so one of the things that I think people will point out and would be a useful thing to just tie in generally the project too is all of these happen in the context of emergency powers, war powers. I mean, and that's a very sort of robustly developed field. And one of the things is you see that this has to get resolved even in the context of democracy within the polity, right? People have different beliefs about who should and to what extent in a democratic society should people be stepping into the state of exception. So you can see this very clearly, right, in the emergency powers context, but now we're having this debate in the United States in the context of we have post-crisis litigation, right? Exactly on this issue of should there be anyone in the financial context who can step into the state of exception, and then do we immunize them from the type of rule-based claims that right now are being sort of that the government is being subjected to. So I think in this way, the law-finance paradox has been articulated in another context as the law and freedom, I mean, this is the Weberian law and freedom paradox, the law and democracy, rule of law and democracy. There's this constant tension that, again, when you're dealing with issues of ultimate sovereignty, you can't escape it no matter how much the level of expertise intervenes, and I think your project really reveals that on a fundamental level. And I think linking it explicitly to those other debates will help enrich sort of people's understandings of the relationship of theorization of this sort in the financial context to other areas that are traditionally considered to be distinct or operating with sort of different levels of currency.
Can I have a quick follow-up to that? Because this is one of the things that I really was interested that you said at the end, and you're also kind of hinting at indirectly, or in some ways more directly in the paper, is that there is no polity directly behind the ECB. But I wonder if that actually helps to explain how its power has grown over time, rather than, as you're suggesting now, that's going to undermine its power in the long run. And again, I think the Fed here, again, is illustrative, is they started off as a much weaker institution, and they've grown over time precisely because there are certain types of decisions that are palatable to the public, and yet nonetheless, it's in individual states, at times the union's best interest to have made. And so having a central bank that is relatively insulated from a single polity or even multiple polities at times enables those decisions to be made. So I think part of the reasons we see central banks very consistently in a whole variety of different environments acquiring greater powers over time precisely arises not just in emergencies, but in situations where you have emergencies and a response where the optimal response is a politically unpopular response.
Yeah, I had a similar thought to Kate's last one. I actually, it was interesting to read the chapters because I read the LTF paper and then see it in application sort of revealed some things I hadn't thought about when I read the original LTF piece. And I share this intuition that maybe the reason the ECB doesn't have a polity is so that it can be a place for resolution of things that polities can't resolve. And I thought there was an opportunity here actually for you, to, maybe not in this chapter, but somewhere else, to notice this dynamic not just with respect to something like the Fed, as Kate just pointed out, but also the tendency, for example, in Dodd-Frank to assign very important authority to more than one regulator. So what's happening there, right? So we have this tension that we're facing that's brought out by your chapter, which is we want the idea of someone to step in, but the polity can't do it because it's paralyzed by whatever's happening, et cetera. So what do we do about this tension? Well, sometimes we're willing to give the Fed sort of the power, but then we have this sort of democratic pull, like where's the polity? So what do? We put a group of regulators together, some of whom have some accountability, others of whom don't, and we allow them to resolve these highly contested questions. And that's what we did in states, for example, with Volcker. Highly contested, very important rule. We don't want to let the Fed just resolve it on its own. We want to have some influence of the polity, but we want to have the... So I feel like there's a chance for you, in applying the theory in that context, to sort of say, well, the choice we'll make in assigning certain institutions certain policy objectives will have to do with resolving this tension between the need for someone who can step in at this time and the need to have some kind of polity that will be comfortable with exercising this sort of authority.
Following up on Mario's and Bruno's read of your piece, I was very interested in their comments. Well, basically, I think also of course, your paper is part of a broader theme that the law has limits, and when things get too bad, then it might be necessary to change the law, and that's not bad at all. And so that's one view. That's my read. In a moment of crisis, the law needs to see it, and in that way, the paper really reveals or unmasks perhaps the naive view that this is a very legalistic structure, and that's how this developed economies work. But I was wondering about Bruno's and Mario's read of your theory as directly applicable to the Brazilian framework, or even perhaps in a more extreme version to the Chinese framework. At least in the Brazilian framework, the way I see it, Brazil handled the crisis very neatly. It actually, I wouldn't say even that the law was elastic in the sense that it changed. I mean, the discretion was there to begin with. So is that, what are really your normative views on that? It seems to me that there is a difference between having a rule-based system with the assurance if things get too bad, those obligations won't be followed, from having a greater degree of state discretion to begin with, and that, of course, can be used as may become necessary.
Just a very, very small footnote to Mariana's comment. While I agree that most often the law did not have to be changed, and I see the point that perhaps it's just that the law, is broad enough to leave enough room for discretion, and then you can decide not to be discretionary within the boundaries of the law. And that story is very much applicable to our case, but there were very substantive pinpointed changes in the law. So for example, just before Banco do Brasil intervened de facto, acting as a central banker in Brazil by acquiring providing liquidity to the other 30 banks, in the Brazilian system. It also bought a stake so it could pump money as equity in some banks, particularly I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Banco Caixa Econômica Federal, or it was, no, sorry, I think it was Nossa Caixa, but perhaps it was Banco Votorantim. But in any case, they had to amend the banking law so that Banco do Brasil would be, allowed to do that. So there is some of both, right?
The paper I presented in the last occasion suggested I'm the first one to claim that having the saving vote really sponsors further changes in the legal environment. So, I think that's a fair statement. But also, of course, Mario would want to have more constraints probably to begin with, which we currently don't have, say, to our public bank scope of action, and that precisely allowed that.
Because Mario is very unsatisfied with the high levels of discretion, right?
I mean, yeah, just to jump, I mean, and this gets into exactly to some of the things we were discussing yesterday about the Chinese model and how people interpret it. A lot of it is because it dismisses all of this romanticism. It's very clear who exists in the state of exception, and it's exactly successful and only able to manage such a large economy because it has basically fuzzy logics built into all of its sort of legal regulation. And this is exactly the debate that people are having about the desirability of democracy is not simply on a political level, but that it will disrupt the very regulatory structure of the state and how it operates. And this becomes then a point at which people agree or disagree about whether or not this is desirable as a long-term regulatory logic in the same way.
Can I? Which is very interesting, this paper, is the fact that while law and finance theory is about the theory of the normal period of capitalism, your theory is about the period of crisis. So in the crisis, we need more elasticity than predictability. The parallel is comes from the fact that in an underdeveloped country, the development is also a problematic fact. We are not in a normal stage of capitalism. We are facing dynamic problems as you are facing in the crisis in terms of liquidity and so on. So for developing countries, discretion is as important as elasticity is important to face crisis in the center of the system. That's my point.
Thank you all, especially Bruno, for this really detailed reading and commenting on the papers. Let me just start by saying I love the fact that you say this is really about institutionalism. Geoffrey Hodgson, who came to our final workshop, said, the movement of legal institutionalism has been born. I mean, he's really the greatest promoter of that, so I should link that term to his. But we've just co-authored a paper with Simon Deacon and a few others on legal institutionalism. The whole idea being that we have to put law much more up front and center in our institutional analysis of capitalism, economic systems more broadly. So that's a really nice point.
Can I interrupt you very
Yeah.
quickly? Sorry, I was just commenting yesterday with Kate over dinner that when I read you, I really in the foot I see embedded in your writings, the old institutionalists.
Yes.
I think the way I read your work is you're basically bringing back the Commons and the Veblen's and if you're in Colombia, the Wesley Clare Mitchells and so on.
Others have commented on that, and I think that there's a point. So I'm not necessarily in bed with the new institutional economists, but with the older institutionalist tradition. But I think it's important. It's also important to bring the law back in, not only as in support of markets, but really as deeply structural of them. But I wanted to chime in on this sort of the couple of themes that came up here with this elasticity. Is it good or is it bad? I think it's unavoidable. But I also want to make another point, and that goes to think about not just rule of law and how state-created rules are made, but also what actually happens when you outsource a lot of rulemaking to the private actors that control these markets. So I think we've really seen the use of rigid contractual commitments brought to the extreme by the private actors themselves. Because, of course, they design contracts so as to shift any risk of dealing with future uncertainty to the other party. That's what they're doing. And this is also, by making these contracts really tight, they create fungible assets. That's the whole purpose. So what you want to do is you don't want to have your buyer have to raise question whether or not sort of the original issuer has any issues. And it's all embodied in this contract, and then you trade this thing. Then it's fungible. Then you can create global markets. If everybody can say we will enforce these things, then they will be enforced. This is what actually Max Weber has called, this private particularism, the interest of particular laws for the private sector, so they can do their thing irrespective of what happens to the rest of the system. So this is where I think rigidity comes to an extreme, and where we don't have a choice, but all of a sudden to suspend the full force of the law if we want to rescue the system. I'm not sure I think this is good, right? I think we should have a better balance. In a conversation we've had at Columbia around the table about these issues, Bob Scott suggested what you want is that propensity of benefiting from the elasticity of the law should be randomly distributed, so you can't game the system. And of course, that's very hard. But that led me to think a little bit about what actually would happen if we granted a little bit more elasticity further down in the system, right? Because right now we allow basically pressure to build up in the hierarchy, until it is either a government-owned bank or the central bank or some other state agent has to be the sovereign to step in and relax the full force of the law. What if we forced entities to basically internalize future uncertainty more themselves rather than shift it to the other? And if we wanted to do this, how could we do this? So that's sort of an open question. But I think in terms of reforming, I'm not so much saying, okay, this is great, right? I like this elasticity. I'm very much concerned who exercise and in whose benefit. I think we've seen actually a series of these elasticity events that have probably contributed to a greater concentration of finance at the core. Where do you want to be when the financial crash comes? As close to the Fed as possible, and if not the Fed, then the Bank of England or the ECB, right? But you don't want to be on the periphery, because that's actually on the periphery is where the contracts will be enforced. Because enforcing the contracts on the periphery and driving these entities or homeowners into bankruptcy does not threaten the survival of the system as such, right? So we get this inequity at the periphery and the core of the system, which I think we need to address, and that's not going to be easy, because it needs a lot of what I called in a different context also safety valves. We have to think about procedural devices to allow people to come forward and make an uncertainty claim that will be recognized, not only when the system is at the brink of collapse. So that I just want to throw out. Kate, thanks a lot and we should really talk more. I think you're absolutely right. I have to go much more granular, and I will. I mean, that was the intent. I started writing the book over the summer months, and I thought if I can just write some really tight little chapters and that I can expand them over the fall, I'll be somewhere. And of course, I haven't expanded anything over the fall because I was teaching. But I'm now coming back to that, and I think what I've tried to do is I've drafted like 4 or 5 chapters in this very sort of tight way, and rereading them myself, I also understand that, first of all, they're not clear enough, and second of all, there's just so much more that has to be brought in to make this really interesting and explain it. The hard thing, of course, with these issues is it's very complex, very difficult. If you don't explain it, nobody understands. If you do explain it, nobody will read. So I'm not really sure but I'm struggling with it. I'll try to deal with this in the future. Who else was on? Mario, yeah, was elasticity point. I think I picked this up. Your point about sovereignty, yes, I think, but this is another one about, isn't it great that the ECB does not have a polity, because it finally can do what it has to do. But the ECB is not really the sovereign who can do it in the end, right? Because what does it really mean to be at the apex of the financial system? You have to be able to convey that you can fully stand in and coordinate the future expectations of repayment, right? And if you are on the top of a politically divided entity such as the European Union or the Eurozone member countries, the threat that one will pull out or others will be pushed out and create contagion weakens the ECB, weakens the credibility of the ECB to do what it wants to do. It is not only a financial thing that it has to do, it has to do a political thing. And if it cannot get the politicians behind it, it has a problem. Now, you can make the argument, so the history of the Fed is an interesting parallel history. You could probably make the argument that actually, and I say this in the paper, the German government silently sided with Draghi. I mean, for Merkel, this was a godsend, right? She didn't have to do another loan to Greece immediately. She could run her election campaign, which she won, obviously. And it wouldn't cost Germany anything really in the short term. And they never used the program. They just announced it. So that's all great, right? It's the Bundesbank guys who are basically pushing for principles. So you could imagine that in a kind of, jus commune fashion, more and more sort of, politicians will defer to the ECB and let it do its thing. But there's still, I think, in contrast to the Fed, I mean, yes, the US has abolished central banks before, so it could do that again, right? But the US is not falling apart, or California or New York is not pulling out. But Germany could, in theory, and I think that creates a slightly different scenario. And I think that's, also goes back to Robert's question. I think I talked about the elasticity issue. Did I miss anything? Yeah. For me, I think these were the most important points, really. Also, and I think the question about sort of private rulemaking in contracting and how we should respond to that, I think is a fundamental one. It's, I think, also increasingly recognized. Andrew Haldane at the Bank of England has said a couple of months ago, we shouldn't respond to complexity with complexity, right? So we're always trying sort of to catch up where the private sector is, and we're condoning this kind of practice that you create these fungible, marketable assets, but they are the worst in terms of setting the system up for self-destruction. It's not so much that the rules and regulations of the government regulators are that tight. I mean, they can actually accelerate some processes, and I also think that the central banks getting involved in this collateral trade and making their own margin calls and things like that can accelerate the downturn against which they have to protect us. But I think we really have to think much more about what a privately created financial system, in large parts privately created, does to the crisis scenario. It will certainly put the system on more precarious grounds because it is so volatile and so short-lived. And when the crisis comes, it will serve the self-destruction much more than if there was more safety valves built in. And I think that's sort of also something where, again, we have to have more detailed institutional ideas how to do that. But that still has to come, and I need help. Thank you.